hear me in the back now?
That's better.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
And a lot of the things that came up for us in discussion had to do with cultural relevances, because that's just a big part of who we also are. So it wasn't just, you know, generational. It wasn't just age. A lot of our questions were, we wonder if this data. Thank you. We wonder if this data, what it was comprised of, too. You know, the people, the you know, the language that was spoken at home, maybe the amount of siblings that they had, where were they, what kind of position did they take in their family, what kind of roles did they have, that then influences their understanding of society, of culture, and how to interact with it. Because yeah, the way that we interact with the world is a little bit different, because we're able to take that perspective from our parents, you know, as immigrants, you know, very, very hardworking. Maybe we didn't get too much, you know, time with them as children, but we had them model that for us. So then how did that play a role in the way that we viewed work ethic and leisure time? And some discussion about video gaming came up also, and you know, how do we view something like that, where I know, you know, Christian plays video games. Dr. Silva Benjamin's also a little bit of a video game connoisseur, and you know, I've always kind of thought of it as like, but it's not really being productive, you know, around the house, or it's not being, you know, you're not really adding anything to, you know, your skill set, or you know, and so these are just
it's
kind
an important
of
skill set.
these are just kind of like thoughts and ideas that came, you know, and so we're of the same generation, but then I consider myself being, you know, first generation Latina. I was born here. But my situation's a little bit different, because I was also raised as an only child, and I was raised by parents who were also so my father's Salvadorian, my mother's Mexican. That cultural piece also played a big role, you know, in the way that my upbringing was. Jeanette was also talking a little bit about how they raise their daughters, and they have a 6-year-old and a 15-year-old. A 17-year-old, oh my gosh, 17. And the idea of, you know, did you keep tablets at home? Did they have access to video games? Did they have access to television? You know, why not, you know? And how that even influences the type of relationships that they form, you know, with other adolescents and friendships, and what they consider valuable. So that was just kind of our, you know, those were kind of our questions about, you know, we wonder what the population was.
Yeah, of course.
And I don't know if there's anything else that I missed.
The stuff that I gave you on where she got her research pretty much shows that across cultures, especially European and American, you have similar dynamics. Not exactly the same, but similar dynamics of how shifts take place. Africa and Latin America are a little bit different, but they're similar in the shifts. It's just that depending on the cultural background, right? If you were raised, say, in Mexico and then came here, are you going to have the same kind of trophy, certificate, expectation? No. Because the same social shifts didn't take place over there, and they're not a part of your memory here. So there you are. That's why I brought these, because I knew people were going to say culture, and she says clearly, look, it kind of encapsulates a lot of different cultural realities because it's over such a long period of time. You have Hispanic kids in elementary schools, high schools, colleges, across the time period of this research. So it's not like they just took all the white folks, you know. It's actually over, what would that be, 40, 50 years. Good. What other group? What came up in other groups? Go ahead.
I'll go ahead and project if everybody can hear me okay.
Yes.
So for us, I was with Jasmine and Ashley. We talked a little bit about how the Campbell article talks about how the different generations are grouped based on years and how maybe it might make more sense for the generations to be in smaller years or increments. And specifically for Jasmine and I, we thought that that makes more sense for us in our own like lived experience. So we were both born in '96, and we fall somewhere in the middle of that like millennial and like iGen generation. So we can relate to the end of the millennial sort of generation and the beginning of the iGen generation. So that was something we thought that was interesting.
Yeah, Campbell's question about, do you have such a thing as early iGens, late iGens, early boomers, late boomers, middle boomers, right? I thought was a really important piece to consider as we talk about these issues because they are a little bit different. Because some of you will say, well, that's not my experience. Well, even within a millennial or a Gen X or iGen, you're going to have shifts because of the social, I would think of them maybe as waves, right? This didn't happen yet, but it happens during this generation's reality. And so the change still comes within that generation's years, right? If you think about 9/11, for example, right? Those shifts wouldn't have been in the early, what would it be, boomer? No, the early Gen X maybe, the millennials, the early millennials. Wouldn't have happened, then it happened. The late millennials, that experience is part of their experience. It's part of their social, right, upheaval. So are they different? Yeah. Campbell's on to a point, I think, that we need to consider, that they're not a unified, what we would call in science, a unified construct. Yeah. Good, good. What other group would you come up with? Yes?
I am Joyce, and my cohort Iskra and I were talking. What we came up with was just, when you said that the generation is afraid to make a mistake, because something that you say now or something you said 10 years ago might affect you for the rest of your life.
Yeah.
Like a light bulb went off, like of course now we're going to see a surge in anxiety and depression. And I'm seeing that with the kids I'm seeing at school.
Wait till we get to those slides.
Oh, there's more to come. But that was just,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. I mean, think about it for a moment. I know this is not going to happen, but just as a possible question. Okay, so the presenter comes in and he's a psychologist and he should know these things, and he says spokesman instead of spokesperson. Are we going to go away from here thinking that Father Brian character is a sexist? Or are we going to say he made a sexist gaffe? Or are we going to say the comment was sexist? Or are we, right, the generations are going to perceive that in different ways is my point,
Yeah.
right? I'm confident that no one's going to go away from here saying he didn't deal well with women, but the comment itself showed his early dementia, you know? What was your name? Yeah, exactly. And we'll talk about that. When we talk about screen time, you're going to see it like big time. Capital letters when we talk about screen time. What other group come up with? Anyone? Yes.
Sorry, I'm going to project too. So, Brendan, Jack, and I, so kind of what you just mentioned, Dr. Silva, about what they said was, racist or sexist or whatever, or they have person. So my daughter recently had an experience. She's an iGen, and what her teacher said didn't sit right with her, right? The generation of X or me was laughing inside. So, and I said, wait, okay, so let me help you separate the person from what they said. And, long story short, she did that, so it ended up that, no, he's not racist. That's how he teaches. He's trying to teach you something.
Right.
He's trying to encourage you, problem solve.
Right.
But it was a very, very interesting experience for me as a parent, too.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I can tell you what kind of got me off on this, the Lukanoff stuff, was my teaching of graduate seminarians, right? These guys are preparing to be priests. And then watching their study habits, watching their expectations, their naivete, and especially the cultural difference where I'm coming in from a scientific view. One of the operative jokes on campus is that Brian is the scientist and everybody else is a theologian, and so he asks uncomfortable questions, like, where did you get your data? What does he have to support his argument? He's the Pope. That doesn't support his argument. That's simply what he does for a living. So there's something in this explaining, having to explain, how do you separate the person from the behavior, that we all ought to be. I mean, I don't think I'm projecting anything. We ought to be experts at that. Otherwise, what are we doing in psychotherapy? You know what I mean? You know, saying you're depressed is not the same thing as saying you're suffering from symptoms of depression. Those are two different things. And if we're not experts at that, I'm not sure how we get there. But that's why we have supervisors who may or may not be professors, right? I may not be good as a supervisor because it's just not the set of skills I've developed over time. I'm really good as a therapist. I'm pretty good at that piece. I've done it for a while, good at it, because I ask those kinds of questions, right? I ask those kind of like, what's under that kind of questions. How do we do that generationally, right? And that's, I think what you're pointing out is how do we take a comment from a class and say it's not who the person is, it's the behavior, not their attitude generally, but the way they teach, and what does it mean? How do I respond to it? How do I see it as a challenge to open my own thought, right? Good. Anyone else? Yes?
Hi, my name is Jamie. We kind of focused more on like the cultural work ethic aspect of like the different generations, and how we're seeing kind of falling in line with what you said, with like the differences between working in a nonprofit and like working at a large corp, and how working at a large corp has the flexibility and the resources to give you like PTO, sick pay, vacation days, healthcare benefits. So
that startups can't give you.
Yeah, exactly. So then that it seems more appealing to go towards more large corporations instead of like nonprofits.
Right.
And nonprofits also have the generalization or reputation of having high turnover rates.
Yeah.
So, like an anecdote that he said was like he sees resumes. It's like 1, 2 years, 1 year, 2 years, and that's like the pattern now, at least amongst the younger generation compared to the olders, which is 10+ years in the same company, same trade, and everything.
Well, we interpret that. We interpret the 1 year, 2 year, right? We say, oh, what's wrong with this person that they're only, well, that's a boomer way of thinking, because, isn't it? Isn't maybe it's not all boomer, but I mean, maybe it's an older way of thinking in that the interpretation is our expectation that your job is who you are. And so therefore there's something wrong with you as an employee because you were only there for 1 year or 2 years. What's wrong with you? What did you do to get fired? Why did you get laid off? What's the deal? Whereas a newer generation, a more contemporary way of thinking would be, tell me about that 1 year. Well, I was getting this set of skills and I was right out of school, and right now I'm going to hear the person's rationale from the perspective of I was gathering a set of skills and an experience with that group of people that I can now bring to bear in your nonprofit, in your profit company. Different expectation and different interpretation of the meaning of those things. And that's why this generational stuff just, I mean, I read that first book and I said, wait a minute, there's something here that just, what is it? What's the expression they used to say? You know? Yeah, mind-blowing. And that's what got me interested in reading Twenge particularly, because she does this stuff in generations. iGen is about iGen. Gen Me is about millennials. But it's very fascinating stuff. Anyway, yeah. What other group? Any other group? Anybody? Anyone else? Yeah, go for it.
Hi, my name is Sonia, and this is Ava. And we spoke about the cultural as well, like
being first-generation Latinas and how that plays a big role in, you know, who we stand for in our role as MFT trainees. So from the students' perspective, that's something that came up for us. Also what came up for us was in regards to just to stay relevant. Like we both said, we appreciated how you gave us this overview where me being almost 51 and I have a 13-year-old, to stay relevant is huge. So with our clients as well,
Right.
School-age kids, they're coming in, they have this way of thinking.
Right.
So we brought that up, that we appreciate, like at the end of the day, we want to stay curious and we want to continue being able to set those examples, but also learn from
Right.
these kids that are coming up and
Right.
giving us that. And then on the side note, in regards to gaming, I just wanted to say,
Are you a Fortnite player?
no, no, but I have a teenager, and
Oh.
when I was able to dialogue in a Minecraft realm,
There you
that
go.
was awesome.
There you go.
That's all
When you
I'm
can
gonna say.
speak the language. Okay, just so you know, I play Fortnite. That's where I've learned that's where I've made some of those friends on Twitch. I play Skyrim where people tell me, Father Brian, because they know I'm a priest, in their Twitch channels. Father Brian, you gotta move, that's old. You gotta move away from that. That game's, what is it now, 12 years old, I think. But I really enjoy it. So I picked up other games along the way that, you know, first-person shooters, they're not my thing. I just don't have that kind of hand-eye coordination anymore, right? On a keyboard particularly. But the thing that I think, you know, earlier, like you were saying, the translation of what's the meaning of the behavior. It doesn't contribute to cleaning the house or making dinner. What it contributes to is my mental state being more open and free at the end of the day, because I played a game as a transition between work stress and where I am now coming home. Something that has mediated that behavior and personality, right? I play it in between things because I'm working very hard, as an academic, I'm working very hard on reading stuff, preparing courses, trying to do slides, and knowing that this is not anything like what you guys learn to do, you gals, you people, learn to do. See, now I'm conscious. In your how to make a PowerPoint class, right? In that stuff, that skill, you know. I'm very aware, last night as I was going through it, kind of getting it back in my head, I'm going, somebody in this class is going to look and go, gosh, this guy should take a class on how to make PowerPoints. I'm not good at it. Okay, I'm not good, I'm a boomer. What I do between trying to get all these things together is take that time to go, okay, Skyrim, I'm going to go into a cave and I'm going to kill some Draugr and I'm going to come out with a blessed sword and maybe a couple of potions, you know? And then I'm going to go on with the day. But what I've done is let some of that stress and difficulty. Another Skyrimmer? Is that why you're nodding?
No,
Oh.
I'm a gamer too.
Oh, what do you play? He's probably a COD player. This
No,
guy.
I used to be.
You used to be a
But
COD?
I have kids now, so now it's mobile gaming.
Oh.
The judgment.
Lord of the Rings, you know?
Of course. Well, yeah. Yeah, the newest one I think is Harry Potter, isn't it? Yeah. That's the new thing everybody's doing. It's kind of a not first person, what do you call that? A role-playing game.
RPG, yeah.
Yeah, RPG. All right, any other groups? Any other groups? Is there something we didn't hit? Go ahead.
I'm Ariel. I hope I have this right. From what I took from our conversation is basically how labels open the door to offense. And that said, I talked about how being a millennial, I'm like at the end of it. I feel I get compared a lot to behaviors I feel the Gen.
Ah, okay.
Especially if we're talking about, I'm 1992, and when we hit 1995, there's suddenly a different generational change. And I was talking about how I observed younger individuals at my workplace and their work ethic versus my work ethic.
Right.
And no offense to anyone who's a Gen Z, I'm just mentioning that this is what I noticed. It's an observation. where they're more on their phones.
Yeah.
And their position is supposed to be everywhere and everywhere, like, watching over our residents and stuff like that, but then if they have a minute, they'll be on their phone.
Yeah.
Versus I was trained, we gotta clean, you know, if we have
Yeah.
downtime and whatnot. So anyway, she was talking about how, you know, when it comes to generational thought processes, sometimes we can be offended, like maybe someone from a different generation might think it's offensive to have your phone out in a conversation.
Yeah.
But maybe if you're a Gen Z, that's not as offensive. Like, that's
Yeah.
just something that you do.
Mhm.
And so we're just talking about how, you know, if we keep an open mind to the idea of like, oh, well, maybe they're from a different generation and that's why they have their phone out, then we're less likely to be offended.
Mhm.
Because we never know what's really going on in their mind as to
Right.
why they do that behavior or that
Right.
action. We're just quickly making an assumption.
Right. What does that behavior mean to them and what does it mean to me?
Right.
Yeah. Probably none of you remember there was an old book called Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus. Yeah? Did you have to read it for courses or something? No.
No, I just read it.
Okay. Gray, I think, is the author.
John Gray.
Yeah.
Yes.
That introduces us to a concept which for me is important because when I work with seminarians and I tell them women are relational, men are functional in their communication, they don't understand that. So I have to use Gray to say, here's what that means. Now, Gray's research is old. It's quite old. But on the other hand, it's a good introduction. When we do that kind of, what does it mean to them, what does it mean to me? I find it rude when people pull out their cell phone and say, oh, excuse me, just a moment. Yes, right? In the middle of a meeting, in the middle of a whatever, you know? Now, my students don't do that. Their phone will ring and they'll leave the class. Maybe it's rude, maybe not. But my interpretation of it is kind of, I can't think of how to say it, nimodal. It doesn't matter unless I check with them, well, what does it mean to you that you're in a class and you get up and leave to go answer a call? Is it an emergency? Because I would think that would be the only reason I would get up and leave a meeting to answer my phone is if it's an emergency. No, it was just my friend who was telling me that we're on for dinner. Well, couldn't she leave a message? So there's something in this that is, as you say, we got to check out the reality, right? Good, very good, yeah.
I challenge that because us iTens don't answer phones.
Pardon me?
We text.
Challenge it because?
Because you said like, oh, they leave a class to go answer the phone. We don't answer phones.
Yeah.
Like,
Just text,
I
yeah.
silence a call. I'm just like a message.
Oh, I see what you mean.
I feel that. I'm at the end of the millennium.
Yeah.
I feel it. I'm the same.
Yeah.
I do
Answer
that.
calls. That's traumatizing.
It is. Now I tell you, I'm not an Apple person. I'm not an Apple person. I'm an Android person, which my students give me a hard time about. But I'm old. I just spent the week in Northern California with my mother and my nieces and all that. My mother she's 90 years old. She made the most relevant comment one day because I said, well, I'll ask Angela, my niece. I'll ask Angela, and she says, oh yeah, she can do it. She does everything on her phone. So then I'm with my niece, and I said, you know, we got to check on this thing. And she goes, okay. Yeah, they're open, and they have it. I'm like, you're just too good for me, you know? I don't have that kind of proficiency, but the people who do, what's our interpretation? Right? Do I say, what a geek? What a, you know, whatever the current word is for someone who's so techy, right? Or do I say, no, that's just where society has gotten us, and that's just the reality of this generation who, you know, this is more powerful than what Jose mentioned. This is more powerful than the computers we worked on at the universities. When I went to junior college, we had a computer room with those, it wasn't the cards, it was the tapes. Put a tape in, it goes, you know, basic. This is, I don't know how many times more powerful than that whole room not to mention the internet, which is only, what, 35 years old, 30 years old? Yes.
Jessica Drum. I have a question to present because as you all are sharing about the different generations, I sit back here and I was teasing with Rosie where I fit in as a millennial and I cringe at that. I'm 1980. I've always seen myself as the Gen X. Or I'm 82. I can't even remember when I was born, clearly. So I must be.
And you look really good for 82.
Thanks. Screams.
Yeah, creams.
So my question to everybody is, given just the short introduction that we've had on it,
Yeah.
do you believe or do you follow with where, I know Ariel's already pointed out, I'm not there. Do you follow with where you're technically placed in? Because I right away said, I have an idea of, again, my perception of what a millennial is all the bad traits that I am perceiving that I clearly do not have. I am the opposite, so I must be the generation down. So I ask it to...
It's a really spectacular question because when we talk about these generalities, I mean, we're talking generalities to the max here, right? A group of years and everybody fits in it? No, I don't think so. It's a starting point to say, do you match kind of the cultural DSM in this way, right? These attitudes, this approach to life, this work ethic, this leisure ethic, this family-centered ethic. And some people will, some people won't. You'll have counselees who are part of what we would identify as Alpha Gen, but they were raised by parents who were straight out of Mexico. They don't look at all like an alpha. They look more like a responsible iGen, right? So it's not fixed. This is a starting point to say, how do we interpret this? And what do we look at socially as motivating factors, as pressures, as responses to problems faced by this whatever the generational divide. And that's where I thought, maybe I'm wrong, but that's where I thought Campbell would be a great starting point for you to have to begin to question what does all this stuff mean, and then say, well, maybe here's how we can look at it in smaller pieces and, you know, general kind of approaches to work, leisure, and family-centered? I forget what he talks about, but it's work and leisure, I know. So, starting points, yeah. Yes?
Adding to that, what Jessica said, do you think that kind of has, you know how people say like older but young soul, or younger but old soul?
Yeah.
Like, do you think that has something to do with?
I think, yeah, the younger and old, yeah, younger soul, old soul. I'm an old soul. I like this, I like that. Yeah, I think that applies to some degree. I mean, think about it from these terms. Here's a real question to think about. A couple of people have identified as first generation, I don't know the word you want to use. I'm going to use the word that's familiar to me, as first generation Latinas. Now I know we're having a conversation about Latinx, but Latinas, first generation Latinas. How do you overcome this? My parents are raised in Mexico with a certain cultural expectation. I'm a woman who goes off to college. Number one difficulty. You don't need to go to college, hon. You need to find a husband. That's the Mexico expectation. Okay, maybe they're accepting of that. But now I'm going to become a professional, and by the way, because I'm making a little money, I'm going to move out into an apartment on my own. What? Wait a minute. Latinas don't move out on their own to an apartment. We all know what that leads to. It's funny, but when you think about it as a Latina, it's really the struggle behind. The struggle behind is that generation in that place having a set of interpretations and expectations that are not realized easily in this culture, in this time, with this Anglo expectation, right? I'm very accepting of women. I've met women like that, the nun I mentioned that I showed the book to, who basically took the book apart and said, I don't agree with this, but his research is good, but I don't agree with this, you know. And I'm like, whoa, I didn't even get that deep, you know. And she did it in a week. I have all the respect in the world for academics, whether male or female. But the cultural piece that we look at, how do we overcome some of that expectation and interpretation, right? I had that when I was first ordained as a priest. 19-year-old girl comes to me. She's from a Spanish-speaking Latin family. She's at Northridge. She's doing well. She's got her own car. She's got a job on the side. She is set from an Anglo perspective. And she's complaining that her father won't let her out after a particular time of night, and he won't let her date, and the normal stuff. And I, like the dumb Anglo I was at the time, I say, well, you've got a job, and you've got a car, and you've got going to college, and well, why don't you get an apartment and move out? And she goes, you don't understand. Yes. Okay, so educate me. She said, if I move out, my father's going to think I'm a whore, my mother's going to think I'm a whore, because I only want to move out to have sex with my boyfriend. And I said, well, that's not what you're doing. And she says, exactly, but that's what they're going to think. How did that come about, right? Now, what my name would tell you is, I identify as Latino, but Portuguese. I'm not Mexican. So those expectations are somewhat foreign, even though I understand them. But how do you generationally say, Mom, Dad, look, let me explain to you. You moved to LA. We're in LA. We're not in Mexico. So let me help you understand how it works here. How does that process happen? My God. And not get slapped or hit by a chancla in the process. You know? That's real for you, maybe, but it's definitely real for your high school students. It's definitely real for your college students. Talk to a Latina from a primarily Spanish-speaking Latin family. Those struggles are going to be there. Maybe they're more or less depending on whether you're from the ranchos or the cities, or from an educated family or a less educated family. But the struggles are there underneath. How do I, as a Latina, how do I assert my individuality in a very paternalistic kind of setup?
And you're seeing that also in elementary school, like fifth,
Right.
sixth graders.
Oh, sure.
They're already talking about that. They already
Right.
have this understanding of, because their parents are immigrants,
Yeah.
what do they have to do next?
Right.
You know, like get a job.
And that's when they're here,
Yeah.
when the parents haven't said, oh, we're taking a trip to Mexico and you won't be in school for a couple of weeks,
Right.
right? There's a different expectation and a different social interpretation, right? Anyway, you can see this is really fascinating stuff. We could go for a long time on this. Rosie?
We were just discussing during our kind of breakout group, Adriana and I, and we were just saying that, and then what you were just saying also, Father Brian.
She calls me father instead of doctor. It's okay.
I'm sorry. But I was going to say that we were talking about the fact that you got to be careful not to stereotype because of them coming, like let's say our students are coming from Mexico,
Yeah.
that you would assume that they have certain issues or their background is in a particular way, because what Father just now said, you need to, Dr. Silva just said, it's about you being able to realize that what are those elements or what were those factors that are involved in their background that are going to make it a little different. Like, are they raised in a more educated, maybe the parents went to, college, maybe they are in maybe they're from a city versus more rural area like Bob was saying. So we were just, and then we really kind of like just, it screeched when we talked about, the women in terms of how the expectation is you don't move out or you don't go to college and all this, because, I'm fortunate to have that conversation with Adrian because his sister actually, he was born here, but his sister, who probably also was, all three of you guys were born here. She was born in Guadalajara, but they all lived here and they all went back to Mexico. Because of domestic situation, they started a new life over there.
Yeah.
Their mom did. But because of what the mom experienced here, a lot of what was here was taken back there also.
Right.
But his sister Danya, she's a professional, she's free-spirited. There's no way anyone's putting any restrictions on her or expectations, and she owns her own apartment, and, you know, we're excited for her, you know, and so we're saying, you know, you gotta, and he, you know, people hear that he's from Mexico. Oh, my nephew's coming to LA Mission College, and he's now living with us, and people right away think he doesn't speak English. But why don't you just share a little bit of what you were saying? Why don't you speak English?
Rosa likes to put people on the spot.
Okay, you can stand up.
Like Rosie was saying, I'm from, well, I was born in Sacramento, California, and I moved to Guadalajara when I was about like 7 or 8. So speaking of, I think, culture and, you know, being I myself consider myself Mexican because I was raised in Mexico. Basically, I don't remember a lot of things about being raised here in California. But I can say that there's a lot of misconceptions on culture. I think it sometimes people tend to box. You know, you're Mexican, you have to be this way, or you're Salvadorian, you have to be this way. Your parents have to be this way. And sometimes we miss that there's a lot of other things, you know, going on. You can be, it's obviously my experience as a person who is white in Mexico is going to be very different as a person who is brown or indigenous, you know. There's a lot of things going on, or economic situations. I cannot speak for an immigrant who came to the U.S. with other goals, I would say, or with other backgrounds. A queer person cannot, you know, there's a lot of things that not only a culture, you know, because of being Mexican or being from another country, that's not the only thing that defines your experience as a person, you know? And sometimes people tend to direct it, oh, you're an immigrant, you're experiencing this of machismo or whatever. That is very common, I have to say that. But yeah, I believe that there's more layers of it that sometimes people assume.
Yeah, so he speaks English. And he speaks perfect Spanish. So Adrian is my assistant. I'm very, very, very blessed to have him in our life. He kind of came, you know, roundabout, long lost relative, and we're happy. We're happy to have him as part of Illuminatis as well, of course. But I was going to say, but generationally speaking, you know, he's, you know, the way he speaks, the way he handles himself. I don't know if any of you have worked with him. He's extreme, you know, everyone's like, he's extremely, just, I mean, he's what, you're 20 years old? And you talk about an old soul, and he has such insight, and he has such patience, and so it's like, he doesn't fall into, and I don't think I've ever seen this guy play, video games.
I think I was playing,
were you playing video? Oh, that's an arcade. We went out and he was playing Pac-Man.
Yeah, you got to invest the quarters, you know. Dollars now, I guess.
And it's interesting, you know. It's just interesting. Maybe just as therapists, you get to know your kiddos and they get to know their backgrounds and that.
See, I think the thing about the generational piece, as I said, was it gives us an entryway to think about different generations from a social. What's the impact of social change, anthropological change, psychological development? It gives us an entry point. But it's not a label. It's not something we say, oh, you're a millennial, so you must look like this. You're a Mexican, so you must look like this, right? There are advantages on both sides of the border. There are advantages to having Spanish on this side of the border. And if you speak English well and you have an understanding of the culture, there are advantages in Mexico to being from the U.S. and speaking English quite well. The jobs you can get are a little bit different because you have a different skill set in Mexico, similarly here. And it just depends on which thing you're looking at. Oh, sorry, Chris.
Yeah. So my thing about Campbell's work has always been that he looks at population. And we're looking at population distribution, which is going to follow on a sampling curve of a bell curve, right? And that's why it feels really awkward as therapists, where you guys are used to one-on-one, maybe group or family. But really, and even then, that's an N of 1. Or maybe an N of 5 if you're maybe Mexican family, maybe N of 12. again, that's a stereotype on the population. And like,
In
so,
the Cardenas family at N of 20 or?
so when you're looking at a population distribution, and you're able to, okay, let's pick out these higher order constructs, you're able to kind of start seeing those differences. But then it feels strange as U.S. therapists are going into a conversation and a long-term therapeutic experience with a singular person who's going to deviate from their, by nature. They are not going to be the mean. They're not going to be the mean, the median person of Gen X, or in this case, the iPad group. They're going to be, in fact, by definition of meeting with you, they're going to be away from that. And that's how we have divergency of how they emotionally feel. I think we're going to get to that, I think, a little bit with Claudia's discussion of on-campus discussions with these individuals. But it is good to kind of, okay, from an Anglo perspective of these eras, of these generations, this is what you could expect with going across the common man. You know, things, both words you can take issue with. But then, what are we doing in Pacoima, California, in 2023, with a family where I'm beginning my entry point with someone who's me, maybe a Gen X, maybe a millennial mindset, speaking to someone 1 or 2 generations below, but then going to realize that they're being introduced to topics from they're being educated and parented by people 1 or 2 generations above, right? And they grew up with a large family that has influences from these exterior generations, right? Who have dealt with social change, inter-societal change.
Right.
And so that's a lot of steps away.
We only have a few minutes until 11, and we're going to stop at 11:30 and field questions. So what I'd like to do is get through the next set of slides, and you're going to have them, so don't worry if I speed through something that looks interesting when you see it. So we did the what came up in the groups, the generation you're from, is it relevant to your practice? I think most everybody was saying it's pretty relevant to try to understand the people we work with, whether they're kids or teenagers, adolescents, etc. I want to talk a little bit about screen time. You like the Mona Lisa? Or you like Apple phone? Which is, I want to talk a little bit about screen time. Those who are spending more time on screen activities report higher depressive symptoms. I'm hoping, because I'm talking to a group of therapists, that SX stands for symptoms, DX is going to stand for diagnoses. Okay, good. I learned all those things, and then every time I put them in my slides, my students go, what's sex? I said, no, it's not sex. It's symptoms. Oh, okay. Those with less time in screen activities being phone, computer, etc., report less depressive symptoms. Interesting. Of those using 5 or more hours a day, 48% reported at least one suicidally related outcome. I'll explain what the suicide-related outcomes are. But they reported at least one. Of those using devices more than 3 hours a day, 34% were more likely to have at least one suicide-related outcome than those using 2 hours or less. Now, those of you who are parents, 2 hours of screen time for your child is nothing, right? I mean, if they have an iPhone or if they have an Android, if they have access, 2 hours? To me, 2 hours seems like a long time. And everybody I talk to, and most of the people I work with, say, 2 hours? I barely get into my Facebook by then, right? I barely get through Twitter and see what my friends are doing. Not to mention the YouTube and the Snapchats. And adolescents using social media every day, 13% more likely to report high depressive symptoms than those using it less often. Now, depressive symptoms, we all know what they look like. What this article, I didn't put the citation. Anyway, this is Twenge, I think. I'll look, because it's right in here. Males have increased suicidal deaths, but not increased depressive symptoms or suicidal-related outcomes. Why is that? Well, what we're seeing is males, even adolescents, young adults, they're more successful at killing themselves. So they're successful at a suicide, but they don't show the same symptoms related to screen time, related to time on screen. So that's weird. Females show increased depressive symptoms and suicide-related outcomes exclusive to females. So males don't show it. Screen time may have a greater effect on females than males. Now we could hypothesize, since I brought up John Gray, we could hypothesize that it has more to do with the way women relate and the importance of the comment of someone else about them, their body, their hair, their boyfriend, their whatever, that it impacts them more than it does guys. Guys probably are more likely to just go, oh, F him, right? Than women are. Women are likely to take it in and see it as a relational comment. I'm not sure that's the case, but we could hypothesize that that might be it. These are the 4 suicide-related outcomes. Feeling sad and hopeless, seriously consider suicide, making suicide plans, making suicide attempt. These are the 4 things they looked at as suicide-related outcomes, where they said, okay, adolescents who show one or more of these things. So when we go back and look at males, okay, they're just not showing it in the same way. They're just successful at suiciding, whereas women are not as successful at actually killing themselves as they are doing something, expressing something that actually gets them the attention they need to then, move forward. Okay? So, and then finally, depressive symptoms. We're looking at things like increase in symptoms similar among, their finding was that screen time was actually similar across populations. Hispanic, Black, and whites reported similar numbers. So it's not like Hispanics are protected in some way, or Blacks are protected in some way, or whites are protected in some way because of screen time. Adolescents in all 3 of these populations were identified by this is what they show. Now let me make sure what it is, because you'll want to look it up. I'm pretty sure it's Twenge, but that's leisure. She has an article which is just on screen time. It's Twenge 2018. So when you get those PDFs, Twenge 2018 is this research. I'm sorry I didn't put it on the slide. I probably was old on that particular day. So iGens report a greater mental health issues than millennials and Gen X's at the same age. When Twenge looks at the research, what she sees is that age in 1980 and that age in 2016, that age in 1992 and that age in 2011. And she's comparing those reports. The iGens would have higher responses, high school and college, to mental illness. They feel, this is bothering me, this isn't right, this is somehow too much. And rising caseloads at high school and university counseling centers may be caused by a greater iGen experiencing mental health issues. Maybe due to a shifts, I don't know how that happened, shifts in spending leisure time, right? So now you've gone from high school, where whatever your activities were, to college, where the professor's saying, you need to show up in, thank you, You need to show up in the class. I'm gonna take roll. You didn't measure up. Yes, it's due at 5 o'clock. It's 5:05. I'm not accepting it. In high school, likely the iGens, and definitely what we're seeing in the alphas, is we have more involved parents. So those of you who would be teachers, for example, or you know what teachers go through, you're now seeing an increase in parents' advocacy for their child. He shouldn't have gotten that grade on that paper. You need to change that grade or he's not going to get into a good college and he's not going to get a good job. And you're the teacher, you should know this. You need the advocacy of parents in high schools, even junior highs, when it continues to university. Now we're seeing what the influence of Gen is, right? Because now college students who were protected in some way in high school, which is one of the arguments of Lukianoff, is that people are so overly protected that they don't know how to manage stress. You should at least look at the book. But what we see is higher mental health rates. Not so simple.
Oh, I get it. Hold up.
You like this one?
I get it.
This is one of my favorites. Anyway. This is Haslam. Haslam will once again be a PDF that I'm going to give to Ben. Haslam's article is really interesting in that what his argument is, look, because of this generational change, what we've done is change the definition of things. And because we've changed the definition of things, we now have normal behavior that is becoming pathologized. And he's looking specifically at psychology. Okay? So this is vertical creep. What he identified, vertical creep is less stringent. So let's say now, instead of saying you have to be of depressed mood for 2 months, now we say, oh, it's 6 weeks. Right? Less stringent. Extended to milder variants. Right? So depression is now, instead of something that really interferes with your life, now it's like, it makes you feel bad. Right? So it's less stringent, and we're looking at normal behaviors that have now become pathologized. And then a new diagnostic criteria that encompass less severe and debilitating phenomena. So when you look at the DSM, look at the DSM previous or a couple previous, and look at the symptoms, and you'll see, well, wait a minute, this went from this to this. This got kind of thrown in with that. Now we have a spectrum. We don't have Asperger's anymore. Now we have a spectrum. Right? We don't have the same look at addiction that we used to have, and I'll talk about those in just a sec, but to look at those things. The horizontal creep extends to a qualitatively new class of phenomena. We didn't used to call, for example, we'll talk about bullying. Bullying wasn't really it doesn't look anything like what we call bullying today. Okay? Applied to a new context. So the same stuff applied to a new context. And another horizontal creep is we get refugees, for example, people displaced by environmental catastrophes. No, refugees are people who come to a new place because they've been oppressed in a societal, governmental, violent, etc. It's not just about how people talk about you. You're not a refugee from a flood. That's not refugee, right? So we've taken something that we know and we've expanded it, and that's the horizontal. Okay? So here we go. He talks about 6 of them. I'll get through them real quick so we can get to the questions. But he talks about abuse, for example, and he says there are 3 changes: psychological, emotional abuse, adult-child behavior, and extension to neglect. So abuse was typically seen as a commission. Let's use those terms, a commission. The parent abused, the child was abused by the stepfather. Violent, physical, left bruises, all of those things. That is child abuse. Now we've said, well, child abuse includes neglect. Well, that's not commission, that's omission. I haven't given you something that you think you need. I haven't given you something that society would say, I ought to have given you, right? The latest one, I was listening to the news and I was going, what the heck is this? There's this whole ad, I was driving in Oakland because I was up in Northern California. And there's this whole thing about toxic stress in children. And I'm thinking, what is this toxic stress? Well, the ad is about children being raised and having to deal with problems in life and difficulties with peers. And I'm going, toxic stress? How did we get from normal things kids have to learn to deal with to toxic stress, which would now be an identifier that says we ought to intervene? How do we get from a normalcy to a not normalcy, right? So Haslam, and this one I got right, see, I got him down there, also talks about introducing omission as an element of abuse while previous definition was solely commission, right? So you had to do something. We're going to get that same thing when we get to bullying. What was bullying? Groups of people who were older, bigger, upperclassmen, upperclass women, etc., in school who mistreated me physically, beat me up, all that stuff. Now, bullying, you said something bad about me online. Okay, is that bullying? Or is that some other form of inappropriate behavior? By identifying it as bullying, are we expanding the definition? And what does it mean to expand the definition? And then finally, intangible acts are entered into the definition. We can't quantify. Okay, bullying, we have the same concepts. It's not seen as peer aggression without power differential and repeated, right? Now we identify bullying in business, in work. My boss said something to me that hurt my feelings. I don't mean to trivialize it. It's a part of the definition that we would say, you've been bullied. No, not really, right? No, that's not bullying. Bullying is a group of people who intentionally do something to make you look bad, feel bad, hurt you, violent. This is an extension of that, and Haslam's point is, we've expanded these things, and does it really make sense? Changes in cyberbullying, for example, what is that? Adult workplaces, behaviors element. Behavior is an element rather than above an exclusion, not seen. So, is it bullying if I just don't want to be your friend? I don't want to play with you in the playground? Probably many of us who are younger would say, yeah, that's bullying. You're not treating the person right. Well, it's not bullying. It's some other thing. But we've put it into bullying, and what we've done is expand. So how do we see that? I don't mind if you do it, but know why you did it, know what the complication is of doing it. Why is it bullying? It's exclusion. Okay. Is exclusion bullying? I don't want to be your friend? Not really. If I just don't play with you in the playground, but I treat you well in class, I don't beat you up, my friends don't beat you up, I'm not bigger than you, I'm not an upperclassman, I simply don't want to be your friend. There's no bullying to it, it's just exclusion. Okay, trauma, originally brain trauma, physical insult, external event, effect of organic disturbance, leads to psychological symptoms. Now, broader sense of injury, cluster of symptoms expanded, psychological trauma is included. What is that? What is psychological trauma? Right? How have we gotten to a place where, and here we go, with what I said earlier in the day, where my opinion is normative? Well, I experienced a trauma. What was the trauma? My dog got hit by a car. what's the trauma? I broke a nail, and I broke it in public. People saw it. Oh my God, Betty will never accept me now. Right? There are different definitions of trauma for different people, and how do we, as therapists, say, okay, is that on the upper end? Yeah, it probably is really traumatic. Is that on a different end of that spectrum where I wouldn't call it a trauma, but they are? Trauma is now referred not only to physical wound, but psychological wounds. And a traumatic event may now be a constellation of events. Right? Vietnam War, PTSD, seeing your friend shot in a hole, yeah, trauma. Coming back here and having difficulty in work settings because you can't focus, not trauma, something else. Different name, different label. But we've allowed individuals to kind of define the definition. Mental disorder, this is one that fascinated me, so I actually looked it up. The proliferation of disorders. In DSM-1, there were 106 disorders, 2, 182, 3, 265, 4, 300. I don't know how many there are in the new one, in the 5.
It's the same.
Well, is it 300?
It's the same, but they've recategorized. We just had a
Right, they're not axes. They're not axes anymore. But to look at this, something has happened where we saw this as a disorder and this as a normalcy that now we see as disorder. Yeah, that's disorder too. Right? So to be aware that there may be things that have happened along the way that are not going to be that helpful to us. We've expanded the domains. Previously normal issues now seen as mental illness, right? Go back to the parent who allows the child to be a free-range child. My child can walk, 4 blocks to school every day, but the neighbors are saying, what kind of parent are you? Well, it's a normal behavior. No, it's not. It's a normal behavior. So what do we do with that when we get to things like diagnoses, and how do we see stuff as mental illness versus normalcy? Addiction is now broadened. There's a big, what would you call it? There's a big conversation, discussion about addiction, right? Substance abuse versus process addictions. I personally fall on the side of process addictions are not addictions. They're compulsive behaviors that the person doesn't control. They're not addictions, right? That's a conversation. Some people would say, oh yeah, eating disorders, gambling disorders, sexual addiction. I would say those are extensions that I want to be careful about, because here's why. Those of you who are married, your spouse decides that they're sexually addicted. Now they have to give up sex. No more. I'm addicted. No alcohol. No sex. That's what addiction is. I've got to stop it because I'm addicted to it. Right? Your spouse decides this is what they need to do for their life. Even more importantly, eating disorders. Sorry, I can't eat any food. How do we then navigate this? Now they've added gambling addiction, which is a process addiction, but maybe it has something to do with hormonal differences in the brain and chemical differences. I'm just one of those people who says, if it doesn't come from outside the body and it's a chemical that impacts your brain, it's probably not the addiction, it's probably a compulsion and an obsessive thought. Now, you can disagree with that, and there is disagreement in the psychological field about whether process addictions are actual addictions. But the DSM now puts gambling in there. They didn't put the others, I think, just gambling, right?
Gambling.
Yeah. Previous focus on the effects, and that should be of, compulsive activity has been reframed. So we don't see it as compulsive activity. I'm addicted. When I was working in Maryland, I was in an inpatient treatment center for clergy who were accused of misconduct. And we would say, you have to go to a 12-step, 90 days, 90 and 90 is what it's called, 90 days every day, okay? And we gave them a choice. Are you addicted to alcohol? Are you addicted to what, right? several of them said the group that fits me best is Emotions Anonymous. It's actually a 12-step group that probably is not all that, right? I'm going to stop feeling emotions because I'm addicted to them. What? There's something in this shift that I think we need to be aware of. And I'm making it funny, but we really have to think about it. It's not just as simple as I'm sexually addicted. Well, what does that mean? It means it's a compulsion you don't control. And your thoughts, obsessions, that you don't control. Great. Now we give it a different title, different tag. But how do we do that with this addiction thing where society says, no, no, it's an addiction. Okay, then stop. Stop eating. Stop breathing air. Tell your spouse, okay, no more sex for you because I'm addicted. When we think about it, it sounds silly, but on the other hand, it's what we're saying when we say process addictions. And then prejudice. This is one that was interesting to me because the change began as blatant bigotry, the concept, began as blatant bigotry, hostility, and derogatory statements. That's how you knew, right? That's how you knew someone was prejudiced. They would say, oh no, that family moved in the neighborhood, our property values are going to decrease. It was blatant, it was obvious, it was obviously over the top. Now, microaggressions, right? Microaggressions, those of you who might not have heard of it, is, I think it's Daryl. It's one of the two Sue brothers anyway, S-U-E. I think it's Daryl Sue, wrote on microaggressions. And I was at a conference where I was taking a continuing education thing with him. And he told the story of how he came up with this idea. He said he was giving a presentation at a conference, I think it was Chicago or somewhere, and he was in the elevator, and one of the people at the conference came into the elevator, and they said, Dr. Sue, I'm just so impressed. Your English is so good. Well, if you've ever seen Dr. Sue, he is obviously Chinese in his appearance. Long, slender face, etc. Very Chinese. Anybody not know what he looks like? He looks really Chinese. Okay. So she comes in and she says, your English is quite good. And he says, it should be. I grew up in public schools in Milwaukee. What he identifies as microaggressions is she assumed that because he was Chinese, he wouldn't speak English well, and that's a microaggression. I'm not against microaggressions. I think they're a wonderful thing as a tool. But I think when we say microaggression as, in the same breath, Brian said spokesman and not spokesperson. When we look at it as a unified construct that means you're sexist, you're racist, you're... let's go soft on that. Because it doesn't mean that. It could mean a lot of things. Now it's an aversion, an implicit, a microaggression. Could mean a lot of things. Prejudice could come out in a lot of ways. And a lot of things people say that are not actually prejudice can be interpreted that way because they don't match my view of the world and because my voice is normative, because I am offended. They're interpreted now in a particular way. Does that make any sense at all? So what I'm saying is go soft, go easy on some of these changes and understand it opens us up to a difficulty, right? I'll just use process addictions because it's kind of my pet peeve. But it opens us up to, everybody gets to define what an addiction is for them. And then clinically we have a difficult time fitting it into something that is treatable because we're using alcohol to treat process addictions. And that's where we get, okay, stop eating food. Whoa, wait a minute. I'm addicted, I'm not dead, right? There's something in that shift that means we need to go easy on the definitions and easy on how we treat some of these concepts. I think I'm about at 11:20. Am I good or what? Comes from teaching. You just kind of go internal, right? Or for you all, I almost said it, I didn't say it. For all of y'all, as we say in Texas, right, Ben? For all y'all, it's probably in your head at the end of a session. We're drawing down to the last couple of minutes. Claudia knows, she's shaking her head. Yeah, she's going, yep. Questions, observations, etc. And I think we have, what do we have, 20 minutes for this, maybe half an hour? And then we go to lunch. Lunch is at noon. So we have a good, healthy half an hour for questions and so on. Not everybody at once, okay? What?
I have something to say.
Go for it.
I like when you said that, what is it, when you ask your student, what does it mean? What does it mean for you to be on that phone all day, or go answer the phone outside? And I think that reminds me of me when my daughters were young.
Yeah.
And at work, I left my phone was on, and I would answer it, because I knew if something happened to my daughters, I had to be there for my daughters.
Yeah.
And now, it's not like that. Now I
Right.
can turn off my phone and it's not such a big emergency because
Right.
I don't have that responsibility.
What it points up is, when you look at the gens, it points up family-centered, work-centered. Those concepts come into play very quickly, right? When I'm at work, is my phone on because I'm family-centered? Or is my phone off because I'm work-centered on any given day, right?
So I just wanted to mention that, and then I wonder if that is also with my generation. I haven't got that gen clear.
Should I go back to the gen chart?
What
Yeah. We're Gen X.
You're Gen X?
And I wonder if that's something that a Gen X would do. Yeah.
Yeah, when you look at it, there's nothing wrong with being whatever gen you are. And there's nothing wrong with not being whatever gen you would be by years. It's simply a gateway to think about, what am I seeing in my clients? What am I seeing in my peers? Even, what am I seeing in my professors, right? What MFT, PsyD, PhD, what graduate students would see in me as a boomer, and what they would hear, like what you heard. I'm going to slip, right? It's just the word that I use because it's the word I grew up with, and now I have to be more cautious about using inclusive language because it's what is, right? There's nothing wrong with that. But it means my being more aware. What my being aware means is understanding that that gen has a different ear and a different social experience, as we've talked about today. Maybe screen time would be another example. I don't spend all that much time looking at stuff on my phone. I don't watch YouTubes for the most part on my phone. Now, Snaps and Instagrams, maybe, right? But the phone is for, I need to call somebody, or someone's calling me. I don't see the phone as a computer. The later gens on there, like my niece, it's a computer to her. Questions? Yeah.
Is there a resource that you could suggest so we can learn how to identify between like, the mental illness piece and the symptom and a line where it's not a mental illness? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think I was educated by Haslam, that article that you'll have, Ben will have by the end of the day. Well, he does right now, but I don't know if he's downloaded it. But Haslam is a good start because he gets you thinking about, well, what's going on here? Right. And I agree with some of what he said and disagree with others. I mean, that's obvious, right? But it gets you thinking about, where do I go? And then, of course, Haslam will have his own bibliography for his academic articles, so that may be a starting place. there are a lot of resources, and I tell my students who are seminarians, they're studying theology, they're not even studying psychology. I tell them, go to SAMHSA. Everybody know about SAMHSA? Right? It's a government agency online. They used to be, the books were free, but the shipping you paid for. Now almost everything is a PDF. You download it, right? SAMHSA. Google Scholar. Google Scholar is a really good resource. Not that it's all that scholarly, but it's a quick way to identify the scholarly articles that are full texts online if you need to get a hold of them, right? So a lot of this that I did today, a lot of what's in my binder of the articles I referred, somebody said something about, Haslam said this, I went, Google Scholar, Haslam. It's a quick way to find them, and it's a quick way to identify, is that something I want to search? If I can download it, I'll just download it electronically. It doesn't matter, I can get rid of it later. But those resources, I think, are in Haslam, or maybe SAMHSA, maybe Google Scholar. There's also, what's it called now? It's Med Plus or Medline Plus, I think, which has medical information. So if you need that kind of thing. They're just resources that are not perfect, but they're resources that get you to the place where you can identify, this is a piece I could use. SAMHSA has a lot of those. SAMHSA for me has a document that I give to my students, which is they developed a guidebook for clergy working with alcohol issues in parishioners. And it's a regular book, but it's a PDF, it's for free. I tell them, download that, we're going to talk about that in that class. So they begin to think in terms of research and looking for the needs that they're going to have as priests in a parish. Yeah. Other questions? I'm having trouble because of the lights, so I'm going to switch sides here.
I have a comment,
Go
or
for
maybe
it.
just a different perspective. As a Gen Xer, I think the expansion that I'm hearing is, yes, it is for our clients, but for some of us that didn't understand what was happening in our household when we were kids,
yeah.
And it has given a lot of answers. And I think, as scary as that sounds for some Gen Xers
Yeah.
that have gone through trauma, that are now understanding, yeah, that was not really supposed to happen. We always knew about it, but no one ever talked about it.
Right.
So I think, as scary as it is for our clients, but it's also, I believe, a way for us to possibly begin to open up to healing as we're getting older.
Right.
So
I
it is
agree.
a gateway to kind of go in and say, okay.
I agree, there are parts of graduate school that are very healing. There are parts of graduate school that are not so healing. If you're in a doctoral program, when you get to your dissertation, if you don't get asthma or stomach acid or something, then there's something wrong with you, right? Graduate school is healing in that we learn a lot about how to apply. Oh, now I understand. My big question in graduate school, honestly, was if we say that, 80–90% of families are dysfunctional, then why don't we call that the normal family? We don't. We say they're dysfunctional, but we say the normal family is this wonderful, idyllic kind of thing, I mean, it's weird in how we see it, is what I'm saying. Not that that's, the way it should be, but that we ought to be more thoughtful about, yeah, I look at this and I say, yeah, I grew up in this kind of family. I grew up in an alcoholic family. My father went to work all day. He made decent money. He made sure to support us. My mother cooked. She was a homemaker, older model of marriage and family raising. But my father would come home at night drunk. Okay, did it impact me? Yes. Am I aware of how it impacted me? I'm very well along the way of understanding how it impacted me. But I'm not naive enough to say that I have recognized all the ways in which it's done that. Graduate school offered me a way to say, this is what other people are impacted by in an alcoholic family. Is that what was there for me? Was that the constellation of things that were there for me? And to understand that. I'm not a label person. I really don't like saying, oh, yeah, that's the label I'm gonna, you know, it's just not who I am. Maybe I'm a bad like, psychologist from that standpoint. Insurance companies would say so. Everybody gets adjustment disorders. Which don't exist anymore.
We don't need it.
Yeah.
They won't pay it, so we don't need it.
Yeah. You gotta put something on it, right? But you're right, I think that these things give us a way to think about the issues and to think about our clients that ought not be too written in stone, I would say. They ought to be entryways to the understanding piece and not boxes and labels that we fit people into.
I think because, well, I entered graduate school in 1980, right? A few DSMs ago, right? And it's like, what the heck is this, right? And it's been changing all this time.
Is there only two?
I don't know.
Would have been three. Yeah, DSM 3. You're right, so it's 5, yeah.
Right, so all, yeah, these differences, and this is what it is. It's like, well, no, now we changed it, you know, and things like that. And then after that, you read about, like I said, insurance companies with what they accept, what they don't accept, what they're rigid about. It's like, well, why is it there if you guys don't recognize it or respect it, right? And then here, like you guys are, you're all in graduate school, and you hear these things you hadn't heard ever before, and it's like, that must be it, right? That must be how it is and how to use it, etc. And versus the reality is like, no, there are things that we hear about, and it's more on the spectrum. I think now what I've come is like, it's like we talk about, you know, there's no more this, it's a spectrum. You're on the spectrum. It's like, okay, because it's not as rigid. However, being able to, like, I say it, and I say it to those of you that I supervise, everybody is, I still have not met the fully functional family, right? My family is not where I came from, and even my family that I have. Where there's a level, a degree of dysfunction.
Ben must be the IP in this, right? behind you, Jose, Ben's going.
So there's a, because of our humanity, you know, say nobody doesn't have some degree or some part of them that is quote dysfunctional. It's a question of, but is that to the point where it's a problem? There's something to be treated. There's something where you say, oh, is this something to be educated? Oh, because looking at our history, my dad grew up in a very physically and also emotionally absent dad, right? Very, even those of you that what do you know about your grandpa? He didn't talk, okay? It's like, and he didn't really show emotion, right? But he did correct. How my dad was corrected was very clear. And so how he corrected us a few times was very clear. Was he a physically abusive person? Well, defining it from DCFS, yes. How I looked like, no. Because he was able to adjust it, right? So that he was clearly not as much as he had been given permission to be as physically, you know, corporal punishment, right? So being able to look at, like, you need to look at the context of that generation, that era, that culture, etc., and see, is that an abusive person, or is that a person that, as far as they knew, that was the best way to do things, and so that's where I'm coming from too, is being a graduate student, supervising all this time, dealing with graduate programs all this time, because I've been, since I got my license in I've been supervising since 1990, so I've been dealing with all these programs, and I've noticed a shift in the graduate programs of how they're training you all, right? Where some are sort of like, okay, go there and work and get the experience. Others like, oh, don't work.
Right.
You know,
self-care.
This self-care is like, what? Versus, you know, counter it, do things that help you counter the fact is we're in a very, because I remember my first day in graduate school in Texas. I went to Baylor University. There were 2 old white guys, you know, who started the program. And they're like, and with their southern, and I learned how they speak in Texas, it's like, we feed off human misery. But that's the truth.
Yeah.
If you're really treating mental health issues, those that need treatment, it's misery. These people are miserable.
Right.
Right? And where our job is to help
Impacting their daily function.
and we want to help them, right? Be less, go shift from miserable to, wow, wouldn't it be great that they can be happy, that they can be at peace, that they can be
Coping strategies.
Yeah, so teaching them that you didn't deserve that, yeah, that did happen, what did that mean about you, etc. So there's all these, you know, that's why I feel bad somewhat about you all, because they're like, you're getting these academic, and now you come into our real world of treating, right? Theory, now practice, professors versus therapists, right? In a very imperfect world,
Right.
impacted by another imperfect world like school setting, right? And so, all this stuff, it's like, it can be overwhelming, but I think it's, hopefully you guys can take a breath and say, oh, it's not meant to always make sense. It can be messy, and we can mess up. You're not gonna get fired. I supervise somebody's like, I get nervous when I'm gonna have supervision. It's like, remember this. I interviewed you, we accepted you, we don't want to get rid of you.
Yeah. We want you.
We invest in you, we believe in you, so remember that before your supervision.
Right.
I'm gonna be, talking to somebody that supports me, that believes in me, that wants to help me improve, and yes, they will correct me. And yes, they're gonna give me things, and I'm not expected to know that. Right? And even still, there's stuff we don't know.
For those of you who don't, maybe the history is not as, Baylor University was one of the first universities to come up with a PsyD, right? And the PsyD model is different than the PhD model. I have a PsyD also, but Baylor was one of the first places.
The Boulder model.
It's 40 years ago? I think it's 40 years old, maybe a little bit more. What they said was, it used to be academic practitioner. That's the PhD. So the PsyD model that both Dr. C and I were educated under, it's practitioner scientist, right? So we're focused, like I had a conversation with one of the other faculty. He's been teaching for like 40 some odd years in theology school, and he gives me a hard time about going to Pepperdine University and getting a PsyD. So he says to me, oh, you went to Peppermint, that's what you think like. So then he found out the number of hours the practicum hours I had to have. And he said, why didn't you ever tell me that you had more credits than the PhD? And I said, well, because you just wanted to have fun saying Peppermint. But I actually have more units of education than you do. And you have a PhD and I have a PsyD. But that's what's real. It's a different model. That's why your supervisors, you're gonna experience your supervisors as non-professors. Because we're practice people, I shouldn't say we, because they're practice people. They're not going to tell you what it says in a book. They're going to tell you also about their experience of dealing with this kind of population in this kind of place at this kind of time with these kinds of symptoms and what's worked and hasn't worked. So when you say, well, in such and such a book it says, yeah, it does say that, and it's relevant, but it's not the only thing that's relevant. The experience is relevant too. And I think that's where we're coming from, is this practitioner model, which is less science, academic first, and more practice first. So that's where you'll hear a difference. I'm looking at sociological factors in an academic way, but as I've shown you, what I'm doing is reading this stuff because it is relevant to how I teach my students, or how I help the seminarians to get through what they get through. Now, I don't do treatment with the seminarians because I teach them. That would be a dual relationship, which is a bad thing. Bad thing. Other questions? Other observations? Go for it.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. The idea that, I guess I should back up a little bit. My daughter has been traumatized,
Okay.
which has led some people in the community to think that there's abuse, like all trauma equals abuse. And I'm like, has anyone else run into this conundrum? Because the way I see it, you know, everybody has different levels of trauma, but
Right.
all trauma does not equal abuse.
Right.
But there's been this, I don't know how to say what I mean.
Right. It's the broadening of the category.
Yeah, that's it.
Right?
Yeah.
We used to see abuse as physical, where are the bruises, broken legs, x-rays, sexual abuse. Now, you didn't give me what I wanted is traumatic, right? Or you didn't give me what the next door neighbor's daughter had is now trauma. And I'm not joking, it's the broadening of the category that gets us there. And that's where I think Haslam's argument is a valid argument to consider. As I say, I don't totally agree with everything he says, but who agrees with all the academics anyway, right? But it introduces a conversation which is, are we taking something that's relatively a normal experience of life that we have to cope with and calling it traumatic? So now we don't have to cope with it, someone else ought to change it, in other words. Is that what's happening?
Yeah, I don't know, but in treating the kids that I'm working with at the school, I mean, some of them have legitimately...
Traumatic background.
Well, some trauma and some it's just how they perceived whatever happened.
Right.
And took it in.
Yeah.
And, you know, I don't want to just be prejudiced and jump to, oh, if there's trauma, then there was abuse. Because there's so many different ways to look at it.
Right. You remember my first century friend? It's, a lot of it is in how we frame it.
Exactly.
Or, well, he doesn't say frame, but how we interpret it.
Yeah.
Right, so how do I as a therapist, and this is where I think we all operate on this, in a similar campus, is how do I as a therapist help this person to broaden the way they see whatever it is we're talking about, so they can see both how it's impacted them positively, negatively, what are the things they need to learn to cope. Coping and stress is a big thing. My master's thesis was going to be on coping and stress in clergy, and I was going to use Folkman and Lazarus, if you're familiar with Folkman and Lazarus's work. It's all on coping and effective coping. That got sidetracked by 2002, or no, that was the PhD. The master's got sidetracked by the fact that nobody wanted to answer any questions. So I ended up doing it some other way. Anyway, other observations? Yeah.
That kind of brings up social media and the screen time.
Mm.
And how much more accessible this information is. People who went to school, study psychology in the 70s and 80s, where they had textbooks, just didn't really exist. Nowadays, a fifth grader can just go on Google and be like, what is trauma? And then Google just shoots thousands upon thousands of pages.
Right.
Also, I said social media. One social media I noticed we never mentioned was TikTok, which is the most popular and the most influential one.
And the most toxic chat.
Yeah. Exactly. So, like these kids and even young adults are exposed.
You know why I didn't is because I don't have TikTok. I've been convinced by my gamer friends to get Snap and Insta.
See, Snapchat's not used for youngers. Facebook is like for.
Oh, Facebook is.
Oh, they're doing this.
Facebook is way passe. Right. Facebook is way passe from what we used to do.
Facebook is no longer used amongst the younger generations, but TikTok and Twitter and Instagram aren't. Those are the top three. So we have to take that into account of like, okay, what is considered traumatic.
Right.
In the literature, there is a concrete definition online, which is what I guess you see the average person is exposed to.
Right.
Is very different, and there's many different
Absolutely.
variations of it.
And when I talk to younger people, I try to express it in this way. What you're going to find in a Google search is a real general thing of how a bunch of people see it. What we're going to talk about when we talk in sessions, psychotherapy, etc., is a particular kind of trauma that's defined by medical people, psychological people, that is much more bounded than a general Google search. So whereas, you know, I lost my favorite, whatever, could be traumatic to a person, we're not talking about trauma in that way when we talk about psychological treatment, etc. So that really what we do is put a different boundary around it and say, yeah, that's what Google said, but it's more complicated. And that's why.
No, yeah, a lot of clients nowadays are like, I saw TikTok and I have ADHD.
Yeah.
They're self-diagnosing.
Right.
But that's what they're...
Tell me about the symptoms. Well, the symptoms don't quite match. And here's why. Because we're talking about it in a much more... Right?
So that's kind of like what I'm seeing now is kind of my job is to really educate clients.
Oh, that's a lot of what we do. I mean, when we think of ourselves, you know, MFTs, I'm a licensed MFT. When we think of ourselves as treatment people, and the reality is we are, but we're also educators in having to say, you know, some of what you're saying really fits in this, not that, right? Some of it is normal behavior. Yeah, it feels bad to lose a pet. It feels bad to flush the goldfish down the toilet. And that feeling is universal. It's not trauma. It's a terrible feeling about losing someone. Now, they may express it as trauma. I'm going to reframe it as the acceptance of life and death, mortality, whatever label I'm going to stick on that. You know? But I think we are educators, and that's how we help people, is by helping them reframe and helping them broaden their frame. Where they're too broad, helping them constrict their frame to see the world in a more realistic way, I guess. Realistic isn't the best word, but in a more functional kind of way.
Adding to that, there's like I've seen on TikTok like a lot of like medical doctors
Sure.
on there who actually, I guess, to reach an
Yeah.
audience and actually try to educate people.
Right.
Will post like these videos like, well, whatever you're seeing online or on this, let me tell you what it really means.
Right. Right. There's one guy that I've watched a couple of times because he's pretty funny. What's his name? Dr. I think it's YouTube maybe. Dr. Mike. He's an OD. Where's the DO? DO. Doctor of osteopathy. Anyway, he does these things where he looks at internet clips of various things, and he comments on them as a medical person. And you know why he's successful? He's good at the medicine piece, but he's a good entertainer, he's good looking, he's probably 30, he's got all the right references, you know. There's something that is sellable about him in addition to his medical opinion. Right. I'm good at psychology, but I'm not good looking, so I'm not going to make the kind of impact that Dr. Mike is going to make on a younger generation. I was a youth minister before I became a priest. That is just not going to be in my future because as a 68-year-old man, I'm going to make those gaffes. Right? I'm going to say the wrong thing. I'm not going to have the right reference. I'm going to say Paul Newman, and people are going to go, who the hell is a Paul Newman? Right? What we have here is a failure to communicate. What is that? Right? Older folks will recognize it and say, oh yeah, he was lauded as a really good-looking guy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and what we have is a failure to communicate is Luke. What's the name of the movie? Cool Hand Luke. It's a line from the movie. Other generations not going to get it. They're going to get Beavis and Butthead, or they're going to get some newer thing, a reference. First thing I thought of with Ariel is what? When you said your name was Ariel. No. Yes.
Yes, Ariel.
Ariel. Yeah. What's the first thing I thought of? And it wouldn't be a reference for a boomer. It would be the name of the mermaid or something.
Yes.
So that reference is lost on boomers. It's caught by iGens, maybe millennials, you know, definitely alphas who are going to watch the new movie that's about to come out. You know, I mean, it's those things that we have to kind of be aware of as a parent and say, well, how does this broaden my ability to do what I'm doing? Because I understand a different set of references. Were you going to say something, Erin?
I was just going to ask, and I think you kind of answered it, but should we correct our clients when they mention, hey, this is traumatic, but it wasn't really trauma? Should we be correcting them on that?
Now, my opinion wouldn't be the general opinion. I would say no. I'm not correcting them. What I'm going to do is to say, you know, that seems like, you could also describe it in this way, right? I'm going to normalize that identification of trauma as some other thing so I can talk about it in a more normal kind of fashion. How do you overcome these difficult things in life? I'm not going to call it a trauma. What's your coping mechanism look like? Do you exercise? Do you lift weights? Do you box? Do you whatever?
I was going to say, as what they call trauma, right? And that's the thing about out there, our clients, their parents are coming to us, my kid is this, right? Or that person is this. Like you hear a lot, the person's bipolar. No, we call that labile. There are persons that are very labile, they're not bipolar, right? And so being able to communicate that with their diagnosing, they know what DSM is, right? Or even then it's like, well, they have panic attacks. It's like, well, give me more. That's not a panic thing. They have anxiety symptoms, but that is not a panic disorder. They don't qualify. So being able to educate them, right, as to that. And that's why we have the ACEs and the CRIES, getting back to what we do, right? Adverse childhood experiences, adverse experiences whenever. And are all those traumas? No, but they have an adverse impact. Your dad didn't go to prison, and actually he was innocent, and in this case he really was. And that is on the adverse, that's a one, right?
That is.
Somebody went to prison. It's like, so that's not a trauma, but as an adverse experience, right? It might have been how he was arrested, might have been traumatic for you to watch, right? So being able to say, there's these adverse experiences that you experience, and maybe that is also having you on the CRIES, which is a PTSD symptomatology, or maybe we'll see if you have PTSD or not, right? So being able to, you know, bring our clinical trained eye and way of defining things, saying, of course that is a fact. Thank you for sharing that with me. Yeah, that's something that you all are saying is traumatic. Well, it's like, well, that's, remember this questionnaire we gave you? That fits, or it wasn't one of those questions, but that would be a one.
Yeah.
Being able to say that there's something that affected you, had an effect, right? Experience that had this adverse effect on you. Somebody else, but my brother was there with me when this happened, and it's like, yeah, because he didn't experience it the way you did. He didn't process it the way you did.
He didn't interpret the same thing you interpret.
So you see, well, if there's something wrong with me versus my brother, there's something about how that affected you. But I'm wondering, if I were to talk to your brother, if I asked him certain things, maybe he'd say, well, that's how I cope with it, but it doesn't really affect me. But I'm a guy, and that's how I.
What we're kind of, I would say, coming on the edge of here is when I was going through training, we had this kind of understanding that you had the psychological diagnosis and then you had the Psychology Today version of it, you know? I think what we're edging into is the popularization of mental illness, and that's how people are identifying their label. Well, I'm this. Okay, when did you get diagnosed with that? Well, nobody diagnosed it. I just saw it on YouTube, right? We're edging into that. How much are we dealing with popularized diagnosis? And for me, that would be process addictions are in that kind of how do we deal with that? Versus, these are the symptoms. You need 1 from column A and 3 from column B, and there's the diagnosis, which is a more clinical medical thing, right? we have to have at least a couple of toes in the popular world, but I would argue we need to have both feet as much as possible in the clinical world. And we need to be able to say, when was that diagnosed? I don't see it in your medical record. Right? Well, nobody ever diagnosed it, but I saw it on YouTube. Okay, let's talk about that. What makes you think that's the case? And then I can explain, I can educate. Right? If we just take it as, I'm addicted, and we say, okay, they're addicted, we're accepting a popularized version of something when we're purporting to be licensed professionals in a specific field, and it's not popular psych. I have nothing against Psychology Today. It's a good, popular magazine on psychology and interpersonal personality, all that stuff. But it's not DSM diagnosis, symptomology, backed by statistical research. It's not that thing. And recognizing that, I think we educate. That's why I wouldn't say correct.
Okay.
I think we help reframe for them, with them.
Thank you.
And just one last thing, because I've also experienced that with clients in the past where they're saying, oh, I'm listening to this podcast maybe, or I'm listening to the, so in addition to YouTube videos and all that. And I'll ask them to share that with me, and I'll say, let me at least take a listen or hear out, whatever interest you have in this education. And then we'll we've talked about it in the next session, and it's, this person isn't like a licensed clinical psychologist. The information that they're providing you isn't from the DSM. It's not from the diagnostic manual. That they're talking about their own experience or this or that. But it's always nice to get an opportunity to dialogue and to provide that type of education on that level where you're joining the client, you're meeting them where they're at, and then you're able to still provide that guidance that's it's supported by evidence, but you can still do it in a very gentle way.
Just very quickly to say, I said it before, I'll say it again so everybody can get it in there. I'm giving Ben the articles that I referred to, the journal articles. The bibliography will contain the information for the 3 books. And then I'm going to send him the PDF of the PowerPoint later on when I get home. So you'll have all that stuff. Both Dr. C and Ben, all 3, Rosie too, all have my contact information. So if you have questions, ask them for my email, right? Hey, this is so-and-so from Luminatius, I just had this question, or can you give me a direction on? I'm more than open to be available in the future. So you let me know if you need something and I'll do what I can. Okay? Cool deal?
Now you can clap.
Take a picture.
Yes, so as he said, we're going to be adding all his information to our resources, just as we're taping this, so it'll be on our YouTube, one of our trainings, right? And so just a little something, this is from a training that we had before, Dr. Pinedo, right? So if you don't have this book, it's for you. Okay, and then it's a compendium to his presentation that he gave on, which is on our resources on our YouTube, right? And so this is for you to pick up, as well as, just quickly, we do have some more shirts. One, we need to make sure if you don't have one, that we give one to you. If you already have one and you want another one, especially I'd say if you're on a campus, if we have your size, take another one, or let us know that you want another one, and we'll get you another shirt. Okay? We don't have baseball caps. You guys like baseball caps?
Yes.
Okay. Or Illuminati has baseball caps. All right.
Did you know that was coming?
I'll work on it, yeah.
we can have the logo, we'll get that. Okay? And other than that, I think we're ready to do lunch. Okay? And so, shall we, since we do have, now we can have your father.
Wants to make me work twice.
Yeah. You're on the clock. For those of you that will indulge.
Almighty God, we ask you to bless this food and especially this time of conversation, that we might grow in our ability to help others and to recognize your movement in people's lives. We ask all of this through Christ our Lord.
Amen.
Amen.
Let's eat.
Thanks.